Alright, so today we're going to talk about rectangles and squares. But before we start talking about rectangles and squares, we need to talk about parallelograms. Because they're all related. They all have how many sides? 4 sides. Okay? They're all quadrilaterals. So a parallelogram's a quadrilateral. It's got 4 sides. We talked about that last week. A rectangle's got 4 sides. It's a quadrilateral. And a square's got 4 sides. It's a quadrilateral. Okay? Flashback to last week. We talked about parallelograms. There were 4 things that made a quadrilateral parallelogram. Okay? Number 1, opposite sides were congruent. What does that word congruent mean? Equal. Okay? And here's what we talked about. So if AB and DC are equal, and BC and AD are equal, then that's one characteristic of a parallelogram. Okay? So if this is 14, what's this going to be? 14. If this is 5, what's this going to be? 5. Okay? Everybody understand that? Plain and simple. Okay? Number 2 characteristic. Opposite angles are also congruent, meaning they're equal to each other. So angle A and angle C are opposite. They're going to be equal to one another. If this is 45, this is going to be 45. Okay? B and D are also equal to one another. Okay? That's the second characteristic. Now, mind you, you got to have all 4 of these to be a parallelogram. One of them don't cut it. You got to have all 4 of them. Okay? Number 3, consecutive angles equal 180 degrees. They are supplementary angles. Now, what do I mean when I say consecutive? This is what I mean when I say consecutive. Back to back and don't share a fence. Okay? So in other words, A and B are consecutive. They're on the same side. B and C are consecutive. They're on the same side. C and D, D and A, they are consecutive angles. Now, they got to be supplementary though. So if I add A plus B, I get 180. If I add B plus C, I get 180. If I add C plus D, I get 180. And if I add D plus A, I get 180. Okay? That's the third characteristic. Number 4, the diagonals bisect each other. When I bisect something, I mean cut in half. So this diagonal here, AC, cuts BD in half. And BD cuts AC in half. So what happens when that takes place? Well, BE and ED now are the same. They are congruent to each other. Okay? AE and EC are now the same. Okay? Those are the characteristics of a parallelogram. All right? Flash forward to today. Let's move over here. Boy. All right, here we go. We're going to talk about rectangles, okay? And we're going to talk about squares. Now, what makes a rectangle a rectangle? Well, there's 3 things that make a rectangle a rectangle. Number 1, here we go. A rectangle is a parallelogram. So these 4 things that we talked about over here have to happen here also. Okay? They have to happen. These 4 things got to take place here. If these 4 things don't take place here, we ain't got a rectangle. Okay? The second thing that's got to happen is this. The diagonals on a rectangle are congruent. Meaning this. This right here, BD and AC, are equal to each other. Okay? They're equal. They're the same. All right? Simple enough? Yes? No? Ready to move on? Number 3. The angles equal 90 degrees. So in a rectangle, this angle's 90, this angle's 90, this angle's 90, and this angle's 90. If that don't take place, you don't have a rectangle. So those 3 things have to happen in order for this to be a rectangle. Okay? Simple enough. It's got to be a parallelogram. Its diagonals got to be equal to each other. This has to be equal to this, and then those angles have to be 90 degrees. Okay? All right, squares. 3 things make a square. Number 1, it's got to be a parallelogram. These 4 things got to take place. Okay? Number 2, it's also got to be a rectangle. Okay? All squares can be labeled as a rectangle. All squares can be a parallelogram. Okay? Not all rectangles are squares though. Alright? And then last but not least, can anybody come up with the last one for a square? What makes a square when you look at it? What's the first thing that pops out to you?
The box.
The box. Okay? Can you be more specific?
The sides.
The sides, what about them?
Straight.
They're straight. They're equal. Okay? So, to be a square, all sides are congruent.
Congruent means equal, right?
Yes, congruent means equal.
I was gonna say.
Okay? Now, is that hard stuff? No, that's not. All right, let's look at this one. Here we go. All right, here we go. I'm going to ask you some questions about this rectangle. Where I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. ABCD is a rectangle. All right? Here's some questions. What is CD equal to? 5. Why is it equal to 5? Because it's the same side as the other, right? Because why? Because it's a parallelogram and opposite sides are congruent. Okay? All right? What's AD equal to? 12. Why is it 12? Because BC is 12 and opposite sides are congruent. Okay? What does angle BAD equal?
See that?
Well, if it's a rectangle, it's got to be equal what? What's BAD got to be equal to? 90 degrees, doesn't it? Okay, so BAD equals 90. Well, if that's 90, what's C? It's 90 also. Okay? Because opposite angles are congruent. Well, if BAD is 90, what's B going to be equal to? 90, because consecutive angles are equal to 180. Okay? All right? And 180 minus 90 is 90. So we got 90, 90. Well, D's 90 also. 90, 90. Okay? Everybody understand? All right, let's go with the inside here. All right, that's 6.5. What's that going to be? That's going to be 6.5 also because they bisect each other. Okay? What's BD going to be equal to then? What's this whole thing going to be equal to then? Well, if that's 6.5 and that's 6.5, 6.5 plus 6.5 makes what? 13. So BD is going to be 13, correct? Well, what's AC going to be equal to? 13, because why? Because diagonals in a rectangle are congruent to each other. Okay? And that covers all the bases that we talked about just now. Everything. Okay? Now, are rectangles and parallelograms and squares hard? Now, what if all these sides were equal? What if that was 12, that was 12, that was 12, and that was 12? What would it be? It would be a parallelogram, it would be a rectangle, and it would be a square. Okay?
So it's all of that.
Does that make sense? A square has to be all of it. A rectangle has to be a parallelogram, and a parallelogram has to be a parallelogram. And tomorrow we'll talk about rhombuses, okay, and more on squares. All right? Anybody have any questions?